You know that moment in chess, right? Right at the start, after 1 point d4, d5, white plays 2 point c4. The Queen's Gambit. Everyone knows it. It's like the most foundational opening, maybe.
It's iconic, definitely.
But here's the interesting part. What happens when black doesn't just grab that pawn? You know, when they say, no thanks, I've got other plans.
Right.
That moment, that decision, that's where we enter this really huge and actually quite diverse world of the Queen's Gambit declined.
Yeah, it's a fascinating choice black makes, isn't it? It signals a whole different strategic direction right away.
Instead of the Queen's Gambit accepted lines, which can get pretty wild.
Oh yeah, very sharp sometimes. Declining, it usually leads to positions that feel more solid, more positional initially. But solid doesn't mean simple, not at all. It's a cornerstone of chess, really.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today, right here on The Deep Dive. Let's do it. We've got a good stack of material to guide us. There's a really detailed House of Staunton blog post. We've got a YouTube transcript from Remote Chess Academy that zooms in on some specific, pretty nasty traps.
Oh, those are always fun.
Yeah. There's a book description from New in Chess about a particular dynamic line, a simple English Wikipedia entry for the basic framework.
Good for grounding.
Exactly. And even some practical insights from a Reddit discussion thread, sort of the word on the street about playing these openings.
So our mission today basically is to unpack all of that for you. We want to sort of cut through the jungle of variations.
Yeah.
And pull out the really key ideas, the core strategies, some surprising statistics maybe, and the practical stuff you need to know to play or even play against the Queen's Gambit decline and all its related variations. Especially thinking from black side.
Think of it like this. We're doing the reading and watching so you don't have to. We're pulling out the essential insights, the aha moments, the traps you need to know.
Highlights reel.
Exactly. So you get the core understanding without wading through pages and pages of dense analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm genuinely excited because, the QGD has this reputation for being solid, maybe a bit quiet.
Sometimes, yeah.
But digging to these sources, wow, there's so much tactical punch hidden there, so much strategic depth. It's definitely not just about building a pawn wall and waiting.
No, absolutely not. And what I find particularly interesting is how the sources, especially the stats, show that what's considered best by, super GMs and engines isn't always the most effective thing for, say, club players. The practical reality of facing someone who isn't booked up on every single line, that opens up totally different winning strategies.
Okay, I'm sold. Let's start right at square one. Fundamentally, what is the Queen's Gambit declined? What are the actual moves?
Okay, so the absolute classic, the most common way, starts 1 point d4, d5. White offers the gambit 2 point c4, and black declines with 2 point e6.
e6.
That move, 2 point e6, that's the signature of the orthodox Queen's Gambit declined. Black uses the e-pawn to directly support the d5 pawn that white's c-pawn is challenging.
Got it. So the big difference from the Queen's Gambit accepted, the QGA, is right there. QGA is 2 deck c4 taking the pawn. QGD with 2 point e6 is supporting the center pawn instead.
Precisely. And that choice changes everything strategically. With 2 point e6, black is saying, my priority is my central foothold. I'm keeping my pawn on d5.
I want to fight for the center right now.
Exactly. Whereas in the QGA, 2.dxc4, black takes the pawn, often giving up the center temporarily, hoping for, material advantage or maybe creating other kinds of imbalances down the line.
And that Reddit thread we looked at, it really hit on that common beginner idea, didn't it? That taking the pawn playing the QGA is just bad.
Yes, that perception came through loud and clear. But the experienced players chimed in, and the reality is, more nuanced. Objectively, the QGA is totally playable. Grandmasters play it all the time. But the sources, especially that House of Staunton FAQ, they explain why it's tricky for amateurs. The problem isn't taking the pawn itself, it's what happens next.
Trying to hold on to it.
Exactly. If white plays, say, 3 point e3 or 3 point nf3, and then e3, preparing to get the pawn back, and black tries to cling to the c4 pawn with moves like point b5, well, that often leads to falling way behind in development. Things can get complicated fast.
So it's not theoretically unsound, but practically very demanding if you don't know the specific lines to navigate getting your development back on track.
That's the key. The House of Staunton FAQ mentions that mastering the QGA at a high level needs really deep study. For club players, though, their stats from online games were pretty blunt. They said it's much better to decline the Queen's Gambit than to accept it for practical results.
Interesting. So declining generally leads to maybe safer or strategically clearer positions for amateurs. or positions with different kinds of advantages.
Yeah, often more solid, or sometimes, as we'll see, positions where black has specific counterattacking ideas that might be easier to handle than the tightrope walk of the QGA pawn grab lines.
Okay, that makes sense. QGA versus QGD. Practical angle clarified.
Yeah.
Now, you said 2-point E6 is the traditional decline, but the term Queen's Gambit decline is broader, right? It covers other second moves for black that don't involve taking the pawn.
That's right. While 2-point E6 is the orthodox, the label QGD often acts as an umbrella for any response to 1-point D4, D5, 2-point C4, other than 2.dxC4. And the sources list quite a few important ones.
Like the Slav defense. I hear that mentioned a lot.
Oh yeah, the Slav, 2-point C6. It's huge in modern chess.
Yeah.
Massively popular, especially with GMs. The House of Staunton FAQ even cited a Lichess stat saying 50% of masters play it.
Wow.
So instead of 2-point E6, black uses the C-pawn to support D5. And the big strategic difference. 2-point C6 does not block the light squared bishop on C8. That's a huge theme we'll come back to with the Orthodox. The Slav keeps that diagonal open, aiming for more dynamic piece play.
And the semi-Slav, that sounds like a mix.
It is, basically. It often comes from a 2-point E6 move order, but black plays Sot P6 later on. It merges ideas from the Orthodox and the Slav, and often leads to incredibly complex, double-edged positions. Very rich theory there.
Okay, then there were some more unusual ones listed. The Martial defense. 2-point NF6.
Yeah, less common. Black defends d5 with the knight right away. It's maybe a little less solid initially than using a pawn. The source mentioned it can lead to lines where black might even sacrifice a pawn later with .c6 to get a lead in development.
And the Albin counter gambit. 2-point E5.
Right.
That just sounds aggressive.
It is pure aggression. Black throws a pawn forward immediately, challenging white right in the center. It's known for being super sharp, full of traps. And the stats, particularly at club level, are surprisingly good for black. We'll definitely dig into that one.
Can't wait. And lastly, the Chigorin defense. 2-point NC6.
Yeah, very unconventional. It sort of breaks classical rules. Instead of focusing on pawns first, black develops the knight to c6, hitting d4 right away. It's considered quite playable. Even top players like Morozevich have championed it. It's for players who like unbalanced positions and piece activity from the start.
Okay, so Queen's Gambit declined is this big family. But the main branch, the one most people think of, is the Orthodox with 2-point D6. Let's really get into that one now.
Sounds good. The Orthodox defense, 1-point D4, D5, 2-point C4, E6. It's black's most frequent reply. The stats confirm it 27% of millions of on-long games. And its scores are respectable 46 points per 100 games for black. It's really the foundation.
So why is it so enduringly popular? What are black's core aims in the Orthodox?
Well, its popularity comes from its fundamental solidity. Playing 2-point E6 immediately shores up D5 with a pawn. Black isn't messing around with the potential pawn weaknesses or developmental issues of the QGA. They want a firm central presence right away. It creates this robust structure that's not easy for white to just break down.
And that point E6 move, it helps get the kingside pieces out quickly.
Absolutely, that's key. It opens the diagonal for the dark squared bishop, which usually goes to E7, and it makes it easy for the knight to come to F6. With those pieces out, black can usually castle kingside very quickly, often by move 5 or 6.
Getting the king safe, maybe getting a rook to the E-file to support D5.
Exactly. That's a primary objective in the opening phase. Safety first, then activate.
Okay, solid center, fast kingside development. What's the catch? What's the main strategic hurdle for black with this 2-point E6 structure?
This is probably the most defining feature, the big talking point of the Orthodox for black. Developing the light squared bishop, the one sitting on C8.
Because the E6 pawn blocks it.
Precisely. That pawn on E6, so crucial for defending D5, it walls off the C8 bishop's natural path to the center and kingside. It can easily become what we call a bad bishop.
Trapped behind its own pawn.
Yeah, potentially. Its scope can be really limited, especially if white doesn't open lines with pawn trades. It might just sit there staring at the backs of the E6 and D5 pawns. Black often has to put in real effort to make this piece useful.
What can black do about it?
Well, common plans involve playing pipe b6 and fianchettoing the bishop to b7, putting it on the long diagonal. But even there, it might still be passive, hitting white's solid pawn structure. Another idea is to actively look for chances to trade it off, maybe for white's knight or a more active bishop, just to get rid of the potential long-term weakness.
And white presumably tries to stop black from doing that, keep the bishop passive.
Oh, absolutely. A key part of white's strategy is often to exploit this potential weakness, to keep that bishop hemmed in or prevent favorable trades for black. It's a central strategic battleground in the Orthodox QGD.
Makes sense. It's a trade-off. You get central stability and easy kingside development, but you might have this awkward bishop to deal with later. Okay, let's follow the main path. After 1.d4, d5, 2.c4, e6, white's most common move is 3.nc3.
Yes, developing a knight, reinforcing the pressure on d5, standard stuff, and black's almost universal reply is 3.nf6.
Develops, supports d5 again, fights for the center. Seems logical.
It is. That's the starting point for nearly all the deep orthodox theory.
And from here, white has choices. The main one the sources point to is 4 bg5, the classic main line.
Right. White develops the bishop, pins the f6 knight to black's queen on d8. This adds pressure on d5 and restricts the knight. Black's most common reply, played something like 57% of the time according to the stats, is 4b7.
Developing the other bishop, unpinning the knight indirectly, preparing to castle.
Exactly. So black's plan continues. Finish kingside development, castle, and maybe then deal with that pinning bishop on g5.
How does that typically play out?
Well, a very standard sequence shown in the sources goes something like 1, d4, d5, 2, c4, e6, 3, nc3, nf6, 4, bg5, b7, 5, e3, 0, black gets castled, then maybe 6, nf3. White develops. Black often plays 6.e6 here, asking the bishop on g5 a question.
Where are you going?
Pretty much. If the bishop retreats, say 7bh4, black might continue with their plan to solve the light-squared bishop problem, maybe playing 7.b6, preparing to bring the bishop to b7.
Okay, let's trace that full illustrative line the source provided. 1, d4, d5, 2, c4, e6, 3, nc3, nf6, 4, bg5, b7, 5, e3, 0, 6, nf3, h6, 7, bh4, b6, 8, b2, bb7, 9, bxs6, bxs6, 10, csd5, xd5. Can you describe what that position looks like? What's the situation?
Okay, let's visualize it at move 10. The central pawns are on d5 and e6 for black, d4 and e3 for white after the exchange on d5. White exchanged the g5 bishop for the f6 knight, and black recaptured with the bishop. So black has the bishop pair, theoretically, but their dark squared bishop is now on f6. The light squared bishop is on b7, thanks to the point b6 plan. White has a knight on f3, bishop on e2. Both sides are castled kingside. Rooks are on their home squares, or maybe one on f8 for black.
So black managed to develop the light squared bishop to b7. Is that considered a success?
It's developed, yes, but its scope might still be limited by white's pawn structure. Strategically, white often maintains a slight space advantage in these lines. The Wikipedia source mentions this. White's position can feel a bit easier to play because they have more room. Black's position is solid, fundamentally sound, but requires careful handling.
So white has a small edge.
Yeah, statistically, white scores slightly better here. It's that classic assessment. Objectively, maybe equal or close to it with perfect play, but practically, white's play might be a bit simpler. Black often needs to find active counterplay, maybe maneuvers like bringing a knight to e4 or getting a rook to the e-file to challenge white's control, as the Wikipedia source suggests. It's a very technical line, requires a lot of knowledge.
Sounds like deep classical chess. But white doesn't have to go down that road. There's the exchange variation on move 4.
Absolutely. A major alternative. After 1.d4, d5, 2.c4, e6, 3.nc3, nf6, white can play 4.csd5. Black recaptures 4.exd5. This is the exchange variation. It immediately creates a symmetrical pawn structure in the center.
Symmetrical. Sounds potentially drawish.
You'd think so, but actually these symmetrical structures often lead to very subtle long-term strategic battles. The exchange variation is a perfect example. The defining strategic theme here, the one that comes up again and again, is white's minority attack.
Right, I've heard of that. Attacking on the queen side where white actually has fewer pawns. How does that work?
Okay, picture the structure. After black plays .c6, which is common to support d5, white usually has pawns on a2 and b2, maybe pushed to a3 and b4 later. Black has pawns on a7, b7, and c6. White, with the minority of 2 pawns, pushes them forward a3, b4, maybe even b5.
Why attack with fewer pawns?
The goal isn't usually to break through directly. It's to force black to create a weakness. For example, if white plays b4, b5, black might have to capture .cxd5. Now, white might get an open c-file, and black is left with maybe an isolated pawn on c6 or a backward pawn on c6 if white can control the c-file. Or maybe black gets an isolated pawn on a7 after more exchanges.
So white is provoking weaknesses in black's structure that can be targeted later.
Exactly. It's a long-term strategic plan. White aims for a small structural plus that they can nurse into the middle game and endgame. The sources pointed to classic games like Karpov-Dubojevich or Smyslov-Curis where you see this plan executed perfectly.
So black can't just sit there and let white do this. What are black's countermeasures?
No, black has to react actively. One common idea is to meet white's b4 push with court d5 themselves, blocking the advance and seeking counterplay, like in Larsen and Geller. Another way is maybe playing point a5 early to stop b4, as in Timmins-Baski. Or black might ignore the queenside pressure to some extent and try to generate active play in the center or on the king side, using their pieces to create threats that distract white from the minority attack.
The source material also mentioned the Pillsbury attack in this context.
Yeah, that's another plan white can adopt, especially in certain lines of the exchange. It's often more aggressive, involving quicker development and maybe aiming for a central pawn break with e3, e4, leading to more dynamic kingside play.
Games by Pillsbury or Gelfand Short show this theme. So, yeah, the exchange variation, despite starting symmetrically, is strategically very rich with these long-term plans like the minority attack or more direct approaches like the Pillsbury attack dictating the play. It's all about understanding these plans. Okay, so the orthodox main line and the exchange variation are the big, well-established battlegrounds. But that House of Staunton article had that really intriguing point about statistics, that some other left common variations actually score better for black, especially at club level.
Yes. This is where looking at real-world results in large databases gives such fascinating insights. At the very top level, where everyone knows theory 20 moves deep, maybe white's slight edge in the main lines holds up more often. But against amateur opponents, playing something they're less familiar with, something with concrete tactical tricks, can be incredibly effective for black.
It makes sense. You steer the game into territory you know better, maybe sharper territory your opponent isn't ready for.
Exactly that. These lines often let black play more actively earlier, or they create imbalances that are just harder for an unprepared white player to handle compared to the classical lines. Plus, they can be a great way to sidestep mountains of theory.
Let's look at these statistical gems. First one mentioned was taking control on move 4 with the Cambridge Springs defense.
Right. So the moves are 1 point d4, d5, 2 point c4, e6, 3 point nc3, nf6, 4 pipe bg5. Instead of the standard 4b7, black plays 4 point nbd7, developing the other knight.
And the stats on this are noticeably better for black.
They really are. The source quoted 49.5 points per 100 games for 4 point nbd7 at club level, compared to 47.5 for the main move 4bd7. That's a significant jump when you're talking millions of games.
Why? What's going on? Is there a specific threat?
Well, partly it's about flexibility. Black keeps options open. A common line goes 4 point nbd7, 5 point nf3, c6, 6 point e3, qa5. Black brings the queen out early, eyeing white's queenside, maybe pressuring c3. The source called that a strong position for black. But the real kicker, the reason it has this dangerous reputation, is a very specific, very nasty trap.
Ah, the trap. Okay, lay it on us. How does it work?
Okay, so 1 point d4, d5, 2 point c4, e6, 3 point nc3, nf6, 4 point bg5, xd7 looks normal. But now white gets greedy. They see the d5 pawn is attacked by their knight on c3, and they think black's knight on f6 is pinned by the bishop on g5, so it can't defend d5. So white plays 6 point nx d5, thinking they're winning a pawn.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake.
Yeah.
Because black plays 6 point nx d5, capturing with the knight that looked pinned.
What?
White is shocked, but thinks, okay, I still win the queen. So 7 point bx d8, taking the queen on d8. White's probably feeling pretty good right now.
But then
comes the thunderbolt. 7 point bb4 plus e. Check with the bishop.
And white's king is on e1. Right. The only piece that can block is
the queen, white just put on d8, so white has to play 8q d2.
And black just takes it. 8qxd2 plus e.
Exactly. Queen for queen. White recaptures 9 next d2, and now black takes the bishop that started it all. 9 point bx d8. Let's count the pieces. Black gave up a queen and a knight. White gave up a queen and 2 minor pieces. Knight on d5, bishop on d8. Black is a full minor piece up in the endgame. Game over.
That is brilliant. Just a beautiful, clean trap. No wonder that line scores well if white can just stumble into that.
It's a perfect example of how knowing one specific tactical shot in an opening can be worth more than tons of general positional knowledge at the club level. If white doesn't know it, boom.
Okay, what about controlling the game even earlier? The article mentioned a surprising move 3 option for black with high stats.
Yes, the Dutch Stonewall setup. Black can get into this via the QGD move order, 1 point d4, d5, 2 point c4, e6. Now, if white plays 3 point nf3, black responds with 3 point f5.
Whoa, 3 point f5? That seems really provocative. Doesn't that weaken the king side?
It definitely looks unusual, and objectively, engines hate it. At the master level, it scores poorly. The source said it's played in only about 2% of games after 3 point nf3. But, and this is a big but, at the club level. The stats are amazing. The average rating of players choosing it was nearly 2,000, so decent players are using it. And it scores a whopping 50.5 points per 100 games for black.
Higher than the Cambridge Springs. Higher than the orthodox main line.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's all about practical strength versus theoretical purity. The key is the pawn structure Black creates. With pawns on f5, e6, d5, and usually c6 coming soon, Black builds this incredibly solid block on the light squares.
The Stonewall structure.
Exactly. Black typically follows up with n of 6, nev2x, castles kingside. This structure gives Black fantastic control over the center, especially the e4 square, which White often wants. It's really hard for White to break down. And crucially, it serves as a great launchpad for kingside attacks. Black can often swing pieces over queen, rooks, knights, and use that f5 pawn to spearhead an assault on White's king.
So it creates a structure White might not know how to handle, it frustrates White's usual d4 plans, and it gives Black a very clear attacking plan. Sounds like a recipe for success against unprepared opponents.
Precisely. It might be theoretically dubious if White knows exactly how to counter it, but in a practical game, Black's solidity and clear attacking path can be extremely effective.
Okay, and then there's the ultimate aggression right from move 2, the Albin counter gambit.
Oh yeah. 1 point d4, d5, 2 point c4, e5, just boom, pawn sacrifice on move 2, and the stats, they love it. The House of Staunton article said it's Black's highest scoring response on move 2 across all levels, 48 points per 100. And even after White takes the pawn, 3.d by e5, Black plays 3 point d4, and the score stays high at 49.5.
So pawn down,
yeah,
but great practical chances. What makes it so dangerous for White?
That d4 pawn is a real thorn in White's side. It clamps down on central squares like e3, cramps White's position, and just creates immediate tension. White has to be really careful not to fall into one of the many traps this opening contains.
The Lasker trap. Both sources mentioned this one. It sounds legendary. Let's break it down.
It's one of the all-time greats. So 1 point d4, d5, 2 point c4, e5, 3.d by e5, d4. Black's pawn is way up there. White often tries to challenge it immediately with 4 point e3. Black replies 4 point bb4 plus check. White usually blocks with 5 bd2. Black keeps the pressure on with 5.d by e3, hitting the bishop on d2. Now, if White makes the natural-looking capture, 6 point bx b4 is right. Black plays 6 point ext plus plus. White's king has to move, usually 7, key 2-2, and now comes the magic moment. Black doesn't take a queen.
Right. The under promotion.
Exactly. 7 point fxg1 and plus, promoting to a knight with check. White has to capture the knight, 8 point rxg1. But now Black plays the killer follow-up, 8 point bg4 plus dai t shiu, check again.
Oh, and the bishop hits the king on e2 and the rook on g1, the skewer.
Got it in one. White's king moves, say 9, key 1 or kt3, and Black just takes the rook. 9 pi bxg1. Black is a whole rook-up. It's just beautiful. Gambit, checks, under promotion, skewer. It has everything. Shows how careful White has to be.
That's incredible. And there was another trap mentioned, winning the queen.
Yeah, there are variations. For instance, after 7 key 2, sometimes Black can play 8.qxd1 plus 9 to kicks d1 and xb4. Black's down material initially, but White's king is stuck in the center, wide open to attack. Massive compensation. The Albin is just full of these tactical fireworks. If you like sharp games and catching people out early, it's a fantastic weapon.
Amazing examples of practical traps. Now, that Remote Chess Academy video had another clever trap, but it started a bit differently, with 1 point nf3.
Right. 1 point nf3, d5, 2 point c4. White delays playing d4, keeps options open. If Black plays point d5, White hits them with c4, like a queen's gambit setup. The video looked at what happens if Black accepts or declines here.
Okay, let's say Black accepts. 2.dx c4.
White plays 3 point e3, standard pawn recovery preparation. If Black tries to hold the pawn with 3 point b5, White immediately undermines it with 4 point a4. Black defends with 4 point c6. White develops 5 and nc3. Now, the video showed Black often plays 6 point bd7 here, trying to reinforce b5.
And this is where White springs the trap.
Well, sets it up. White plays the powerful 7 point m5. That knight jump is suddenly very dangerous. The video basically said White is winning here.
Winning? Why? What's the threat?
The main idea White's setting up is queen f3, qf3. From there, the queen hits Black's rook on a8 and the weak s7 pawn simultaneously. It's often deadly. If Black tries knight c6, qf7 is made. If Black plays nf6 to cover f7, qf3 still hits the rook. If Black tries nc6, White can play nxc6, attacking the queen. And after qxc6, White plays nb5, threatening nc7 fork or mate. The video even showed a cool knight d6 mate if Black tried to defend against a queen a4 threat with point a6.
Wow, another tactical minefield triggered by trying to hold that c4 pawn.
Exactly. It just reinforces that these QG-type structures, even reached by different move orders, are full of tactics, not just slow maneuvering.
What if Black declines in that 1 pen f3 d5 2 point c4 line by pushing 2 d4?
The video covered that too. Playing 2 point d4 creates an advanced pawn, like in the Benoni. White typically hits it with 3 point e3. Black supports it with 3-point C5, making a pawn chain. White then attacks the base of the chain with 4-point B4.
Undermining the queenside structure.
Right. The video showed if Black tries to hold the chain with 5-point B6, White exchanges on C5, BxC5, opens lines, and plays 6 Nef5, grabbing a nice central square and preparing more action.
And the queen A3 idea came up here.
Yeah, White often aims to bring the queen to A3, coordinating with the knight, pressuring Black's queenside. If Black plays a normal developing move like B7, Key3 can be strong. The video showed if Black plays the prophylactic 7-point BB7, maybe the only move to stop immediate Q3 threats. White plays 8 because Q4 plus check.
Forcing 8-point in D7 because the knight is pinned to the king.
Precisely. Then White exchanges on D4, CxD4, and follows up with the very strong pawn push 10-point C5. This pawn causes huge problems, threatens to advance, opens diagonals, pressures D4. The video ended with a quick line showing Taught F6, exchanges on D7, and then bishop by 5 skewers king and queen.
So these 1p and F3 lines show White has tricky ideas, even if Black tries to avoid the absolute main lines of 1-point D4, D5. Move orders matter.
Definitely. It adds another layer. White can be flexible too, and if Black isn't careful, they can fall into these tactical traps just as easily.
Okay, we've hit the orthodox, the exchange, the club-level killers like Cambridge Spring, Stonewall, Albin, and these tricky 1-point and F3 lines. What about quickly revisiting those other ways to decline we listed earlier? The Slav, Chigorin, Marshall, Tarrasch.
Good idea. They're important parts of the QGD landscape. The Slav 2-point C6, we mentioned its huge popularity. The key takeaway is it avoids the bad bishop problem of the orthodox 2-point E6 by keeping the C at H3 diagonal open initially. Leads to solid but often more dynamic games.
Yeah, the Chigorin, 2-point and C6. That's the wild child option.
Pretty much. All about piece play. Black develops the knight, hits D4, leaves D5 undefended initially. It's unbalanced from the start. Players like Morozevich showed it has teeth, but you need to be comfortable with non-standard positions.
The Marshall 2-point NF6 felt a bit niche.
It is less common. Protecting D5 with the knight, the most interesting lines seem to involve Black sacrificing a pawn with 3-point C6 after CxD5, aiming for quick development and attacking chances, maybe opening the center with point E5 later, sharper than it looks.
And the Tarrasch variation, that's 1-point D4, D5, 2-point C4, E6, 3-point NC3. But then Black plays 3-point C5.
Ah, yes, the Tarrasch. Very important. Black immediately counterattacks in the center with Taut C5. This leads to much freer piece play for Black compared to the potentially cramped orthodox lines.
But the defining feature is the isolated queen's pawn, the IQP, right?
Correct. After exchanges, Black often ends up with a pawn on D5 with no friendly pawns on adjacent files. Historically, that was seen as a big weakness, easy to blockade and attack.
But Tarrasch himself didn't fear it.
Nope. His famous quote, "He who fears an isolated queen's pawn should give up chess," says it all. The idea is that the IQP, while a static weakness, provides dynamic compensation.
Like what? What are the upsides of an IQP?
It controls key central squares, like C4 and E4, providing potential outposts for knights or bishops. It often leads to open files, C and E files, for Black's rooks. And it acts as a central wedge supporting attacking play, often directed towards White's king side. Players like Kasparov used it effectively, showing how the activity can outweigh the structural issue.
So it's a counter-attacking defense, trading structure for dynamics, and the fact that modern players like Dubov are exploring it shows it's still very much alive.
Absolutely. Understanding how to play with and against an IQP is crucial middle game knowledge, and the Tarrasch is a classic testing ground for those ideas.
Lastly, for players who just want to avoid all this Queen's Gambit stuff from the start.
Yeah, the FAQ mentioned options against 1-point D4. Black doesn't have to play 1-point D5. They can go for the Indian defenses with 1 NF6, leading to the King's Indian, Nimzo Indian, Queen's Indian, Gruenfeld. A whole universe there.
Or the modern defense.
1 T6, hyper-modern, fianchettoing the bishop. Or the old Benoni 1-point C5.
Ah, 1-point C5. That links back to those tricky lines from the YouTube video.
It does. If White accepts with 2.dxC5, Black often plays point E6, trying to get the pawn back, leading to sharp tactical play. So yeah, Black has many ways to completely sidestep the QG structure if they prefer different kinds of games.
Wow. Okay. We have really covered a lot of ground here. From the basic QGD versus QGA choice, through the deep theory of the orthodox and exchange, into those surprisingly effective club weapons, like the Cambridge Springs, Stonewall, Albin, plus the Tarrasch, Slav, and the rest.
I think the big picture pulling it all together is that declining the Queen's Gambit is just a really solid, flexible approach for Black. It's not one monolithic thing. It's a whole ecosystem of openings with different flavors, different strategic goals, different tactical possibilities.
And the data, especially for club players, is fascinating. Maybe focusing on a line like the Cambridge Springs or the Alban, even if theory says it's slightly less sound than the orthodox, could be practically better because you surprise your opponent and know the specific traps and ideas cold.
Exactly. That practical advantage, knowing the lines better, setting concrete problems, seems incredibly valuable based on the stats and those trap examples. And while the QGA is fine in theory, the practical challenges make the QGD family often feel like a safer, more reliable choice for amateurs looking for either solid ground or specific counterpunches.
So when you face 1 D4, D5, 2 C4, it's not just accept or decline. It's, okay, how do I decline? Which path fits my style? The solid orthodox, the tricky Cambridge Springs, the weirdly effective Stonewall, the wild Alban, the dynamic Tarrasch, something else.
And how much do those club-level statistics influence your choice? Do you go for what's theoretically best or what seems to win more games in practice against players like you? Lots to think about.
Absolutely. Well, this deep dive aimed to give you that roadmap, those essential insights and specific lines to start exploring in your own games. Hopefully it arms you with a stronger, more confident response to 1d4.
Yeah. Hope this helps you navigate the QGD world.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this deep dive into mastering the Queen's Gambit Declined.
Until next time.
See you then.